Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here when you could be out hiking the trails of Aspen. I hope this will be as interesting a trail, at least for you. So I want to give you just a quick background to why this panel came about. I wrote an article in The Atlantic on near-death experiences, the science of near-death experiences, which involved going to a conference of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. There is such an organization. And what struck me in researching this article was scientists and doctors that you spoke to tended to believe that a near-death experience was basically the brain reacting to being on the verge of death, creating illusions as a result of lack of oxygen, stress, trauma. The people who'd had near-death experiences tended to describe them as profound spiritual experiences in which they really genuinely believed that they had gone to the other side, seen spirits, angels, long-dead relatives, the divine, and they often had very little time for the scientific worldview. And then there was this tiny little group of people in the middle who were scientists and medical practitioners who were trying to investigate this phenomenon from a rigorous scientific point of view while keeping their minds open to the spiritual viewpoint. And we're not going to talk about near-death experiences in this session, but we are going to talk about the question that raised for me, which is, why is it so hard for that scientific and that spiritual viewpoint to exist side by side? And specifically, when you are a scientist and you have spiritual beliefs, how do you manage the interaction or the boundary between those two? Are they indeed separate realms, or is there some kind of interaction between the two of them? So I put out a call on an email list that I belong to, and Nick and Jimmy answered the call and agreed to come and talk about this. And they come at this from slightly different points of view. Jimmy is the founder of the Rare Genomics Institute. He practices science. He's also a practicing Christian. Nick, who we only just learned yesterday, he and I went to the same high school just 2 years apart, so we're both messed up in exactly the same way. Nick has, like me, a secular science background, but he's become very interested in what he calls a secular spirituality through his work in coaching and business consultancy. So I'm going to ask both of them to talk more about their own personal relationship between science and spirituality and how that comes out in their work as we discuss this issue. But I wanted to frame the discussion by pointing to an interesting coincidence that came up for me here at the festival. So 2 days ago in this very room, Richard Dawkins was interviewed. And towards the end, he was asked, what gives meaning to you, to your life? And he said, well, it's thinking about how marvelous it is. This is almost a verbatim quote. How marvelous it is that the blind processes of physics have given rise to brains so complex that they can contemplate how we got here. As it happens, just a few weeks ago, Nick wrote a post which opens like this. Have you ever stopped to marvel, and I mean really marvel, at the mind-bending reality that a creature as crazily complex as you has evolved in a universe that mainstream science suggests is a total fluke? So for me, that kind of sets up the dichotomy that we're talking about, that for somebody like Dawkins, the mere idea that blind chance based on some very specific and simple laws of physics can lead to the complexity we see around us, that in itself is marvel enough. That is what the scientific or the scientistic, let's say, worldview is all about. And then what Nick is saying is, no, that's not enough. There has to be something else that we have to talk about in order to explain this marvel, in order to look at why it is that such complexity can evolve from something so simple. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Nick, to talk about that. Why do you think that is so important to have that extra element? And how have we thought about this in the history of science and philosophy?
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. So I'm going to do something quite ambitious and try and attempt to give us a frame for this conversation and a couple of thousand years of human thought and feeling in 3 or 4 minutes, and really sort of set out where I'm at with this conversation, and hopefully inspire you to think that this conversation with science and spirituality isn't just an interesting conversation. I firmly believe it is the most pressing challenge of our age is to reconcile these two, and hopefully through my conversation and our conversation we can explore that. So let's really take it really simply and imagine you're sitting somewhere in Athens, couple of thousand years ago. And you're realizing, as I think hopefully everyone here will realize, that reality is, when it's most simple, is made up of two experiences. One is what I observe, the things I see in the world, out there, me, you, etc. And the other is what I experience inside here, my consciousness and my understanding. So imagine this Greek group as saying, well, that's really interesting, but we would like to know things for certain. We'd like to have some certainty with our knowledge. It's part of the Greek, the inheritance of the Greeks that we've got. And all this consciousness, colors, experiences, all this stuff, it kind of makes it really hard to understand what's really there. So let's kind of maybe like discount it a little bit and start focusing on what we can observe and measure and predict, which is the very beginnings of the scientific method as a way of understanding truth, a form of truth. And they start developing that, and of course it picks up in Britain and other places in the early modern times. But let's now imagine that somewhere else, a few thousand miles away, you've got a group of Chinese people going, well, we also like to know the truth, but we live in a really imperial society. We can't really change much about our world. It's not democracy in Athens. This is a statist, centralized society that doesn't change. So rather than go and try and change the things we see, why don't we go inside and experience what's going on inside us and find the truth that way? And now, what the irony of those is they're both attempts to understand truth by getting away from what we would now call our pesky ego, getting in the way of what we see. So science tries to take the ego out by observing and observing, repeating and observing, predicting, etc. And spirituality, enlightenment, tries to lose the hold of the ego by releasing, and surrendering into a sense of interconnection and love, ultimately, as I would describe the essence of spirituality, interconnection and love. And so both are really successful in their own right. And now let's fast forward a millennia or so, and now we've got these two traditions of understanding the world have started to become things, ideologies, stories, narratives. One of the things that human beings are possibly our greatest human skill is our storytelling ability, but also our need to have a story, a narrative, a cultural narrative, a creation myth. And so we've now got a cultural narrative where scientists like Galileo are saying, actually, let's just forget all that consciousness stuff. We're never going to understand it. Let's just focus on what we can see. And then people start to think, hold on a minute, maybe that's all there is what we can see. And that starts hardening into this idea of a materialism of the words like scientism, that all there is what science can tell us about the world. There is nothing outside of that. That's a very hard position, and it's an ideological position. It's not necessarily a scientific position, because science is all about anything goes, in the words of a famous philosopher of science. Anything goes. Always keep open, always see what's actually there. And meanwhile, this spiritual tradition of going inside and seeing what's going on in there has hardened into ideologies of what we call religion. And then latter version of that is New Age. And New Age is another ideology around this tradition. And then these two things are at war with each other. And it's actually now, we are in the middle of a violent meme war, cultural narrative war between these two things. And what I believe, fundamentally, let's now go another 100 years, 200 years forward to today, is that we've got to fail, basically. We've got a massive fail because we've kept these two things apart for good reason. And the fail is a fail on a theoretical point of view. Gideon talked about near-death experiences and other anomalies that we can't understand. Creativity we can't really understand through the current sort of materialist, scientific understanding of life. Precognition, which studies have shown does seem to be something. Altered states of reality, all these kind of things. Dreams, really can't really explain them. If there's a fail on a personal level, science is very good at lots of things, but it clearly isn't very good at relieving our inner turmoil and suffering. Depression will soon be the #1 burden on global health, according to the World Health Organization. And in this country, suicide is the #1 killer of young men between the ages of 15 and 25. #1. So there's obviously a fail there. And then I would say there's a fail at a systemic social level in that we've got businesses and governments running around usually with a sort of atheistic, scientific-y, technological, mechanistic, algorithmical worldview, doing things that don't have much heart in them. They're not really love-oriented. They're not heart-led. And we have now climate change, inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a kind of very quick history according to how I see it. And so my work, starting 20 years ago, has basically been about, I kind of feel both these things are beautiful ways of understanding the truth, but there must be one underlying reality here. So how are we going to bring them together? And in the last 10 years, and I can tell you more about my personal story of this maybe later, in the last 10 years, I've spent literally the whole of the last 10 years putting it all together and saying, what's all the science we really know is really great about human experience, human thriving, social thriving, and what's all the wisdom we know from the wisdom traditions, the spiritual traditions, and putting them together and saying, this is one way of doing things, understanding. And that's not enough. We have to use that understanding to make tangible, social, and individual transformation in the world, which is what's calling all of us, and probably many people who are here. So that's kind of like a little sort of sketch, according to my thinking. And
so Jimmy, picking up from that, you work as a scientist day to day.
Yes.
And so you're very conscious, obviously, of what science doesn't know yet and the limitations of what it has. But what is wrong with the viewpoint that says, okay, it doesn't know everything yet, but it will one day. Why do we need something else?
Yeah. Before I address that, can I just do a quick sort of history as well from sort of a scientific perspective? I think there's also ways that you sort of think about the sort of science and faith debate and actually to see it as a rather recent phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So you look at famous scientists of the past, and many of them we know, whether it's Newton, who wrote large amounts of religious texts, or Pascal, or even Bacon. Or even biology. You think about sort of Gregory Mendel. He was a monk.
Right. And some of the quantum physicists as
exactly.
well. Schrödinger.
Schrödinger, Faraday. So the list is large. And this sort of recent sort of phenomenon, this sort of cultural phenomenon I see is rather recent. So sort of similar to Nick in terms of seeing history, this sort of supposed sort of war between them is a rather recent phenomenon. And some have even argued that in order to do sort of the foundations of science, it sort of required an understanding of a sort of a constant world with a God that has laws. So that's sort of, first of all, I sort of want to sort of address that. It's sort of rather recent. And then specific sort of about your question, sort of what's wrong with saying that science, eventually we will know if we sort of wait long enough, and eventually science will explain everything, is that fact in itself can't be proved scientifically. Mm-hmm. So that is, if that's the very sort of fundamental of this belief, that it also starts out with sort of a leap of faith.
But science does say we live in a universe of stuff, and we can observe and interact with that stuff. And so in principle, anything that can be known anything that there is that can in principle be known by using the tools of observation and measurement and hypothesis. So why believe in anything beyond that?
Yeah, well, if you believe that the world is only stuff, right, and in terms of purely materialistic method, right, but in order to, there's no way sort of even to sort of prove that. And even within science itself, it sort of grew out of philosophy, right? If you talk to sort of philosophers of science, or even just philosophers in general, this sort of positivist view of seeing science as sort of the only way of seeing things is largely has been abandoned by philosophers of science and abandoned by philosophers, and strangely somehow been sort of resurrected by scientists to be able to sort of select scientists. So I think for scientists, including sort of myself, there sort of needs to be some form of humility, thinking that, our system of determining what's knowledge of the world, epistemology, science is not a mechanism to understand knowledge, that there's other mechanisms to be able to do that, whether it's aesthetics, metaphysics, all these areas that science is unable to, right now, we can't do a scientific experiment to sort of see what is beautiful, what is right, what is wrong. So those things for scientists to be sort of humble, like, to be open to that. And that's sort of, my big point is not to sort of say for sure there's yes or no, and as a scientist, let's be open to it and entertain these thoughts and have a conversation.
But do you distinguish between things that we might one day scientifically explain, like morality or aesthetics, and things that are in principle ineffable? And I think maybe the answer for the two of you is going to be different for this question.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that people sort of talk about of ways of sort of understanding religion is religion sometimes is seen as a sort of God of the gaps, There's something we don't understand. We don't understand how fire works, then we worship a fire god. And we don't understand, how rain happens, or we don't understand certain process, and thus we sort of stick God there. As you know more and more through science, your God becomes smaller and smaller, and eventually, if you're able to explain all of these processes, then you don't need a God. And I think that's sort of fallacy sort of on both ends for scientists as well as sort of my faith in terms of Christians. And Christians would believe that, yes, we understand basic biological processes, we understand the water. But as a Christian, that God still governs that very process. God sort of is sovereign over all these processes. So it's not necessarily that God necessarily is only in the miraculous or in interventions or breaking of natural law, that he is there providential ruling over everything. So that understanding of God then is sort of not sort of a God of the gaps argument, where eventually if you explain everything sort of mechanistically, not in terms of purpose, then your God becomes very small. And I think that's a sort of erroneous way of sort of...
So your God does not get smaller?
My God gets bigger as I understand more of the ways that he's sort of understanding the world and he created the world.
All right. Nick, what's your response on that?
I would say that I believe there's only one thing, one type of thing in the world, but it comes in a dual aspect, two forms, material and consciousness, the inner experience. And science is really good and getting really good at the moment and very exciting. Science is super exciting at the moment. It's very interested in collaboration and purpose and healing, all these wonderful topics that are really spiritual, inspirations. So science can say something like, people with high levels of purpose or meaning have a 73 or some 74% reduction in stroke, propensity to have a stroke. Great, so now we know purpose is something that even if we didn't know already, if you're really wedded to a sort of materialist paradigm, purpose is important. But it can't teach you how to break your heart open with the suffering of the world and allow the love within you to come out as purpose, love in action into the world. So it can tell you purpose is important, and the spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, can then help you go, okay, well, how do I engage and find and discover this sense of love within me through my experience of being in this shared reality?
But just to interrupt you there, what if it could ultimately find out and say to you, if you inject this particular mix of hormones or, whatever chemicals, it could produce the same effect as your heart bursting open to the world?
Well, wonderful. So we'll have a quick fix way of having a life of purpose and meaning and heart. My experience of being in this conversation and trying to find my purpose and then help others and organizations find their purpose is that it's the great work of our lives. It's an inner journey. It takes a long time. It doesn't just happen in an instant. It's not. There is, of course, a biochemical set of neural pathways, neural signatures going on inside every moment. That's the dual aspect of everything, right? And you can mimic one with the other. You can create experience of transcendence by taking something like ayahuasca or putting on the God helmet or whatever. But that's different from understanding your nature as part of the one reality, which is the spiritual path, and then long-term working out how to each day, in each fight with your partner, in each decision at work, how to bring purpose and meaning and love into that experience. And science, I don't believe, will ever be able to tell us that in its mechanistic worldview, its materialist mechanistic worldview. But what I argue is that rather than try and force it to, let's work together, bring these two parts together and say, for this day and age, we need both these things working together to inspire science that can heal the world, tikkun olam, and to also hold spirituality back, particularly sort of new age, possibly magical thinking, root it and ground it and say, okay, it's a bit of an overreach to talk about some of these things, but what we do know is this, and purpose is important, so let's go and talk about our purpose, kind of thing. So I think they're complementary.
Right, so in other words, for you, there isn't a spiritual realm which is some kind of outside of. It's a different, you're thinking about it as a different way of looking at the same things.
Yes, one reality. There's a visible realm, and there's the invisible part of it. They are one thing, not two things, just one thing. And science helps us see one, and introspection, meditation, contemplation, whatever that thing is that you can do helps us see the other, including dreams, including past life stuff, altered states of reality, all these anomalies which are now starting to be measured scientifically, but the mechanistic scientific understanding isn't allowing them in. because it doesn't understand them. There's no way. Science right now, traditional mainstream science, still can't tell us why me deciding to meditate for 2 minutes and breathing differently can actually shift my physiology, right? Because it doesn't really have a way of understanding consciousness as an epiphenomenon. There's no way of saying, well, consciousness then can change the body. The placebo effect, which we've seen in thousands of trials, right? The placebo effect is real. We all know it's real, but there hasn't been incorporated. So I think science is going to have a kind of quantum revolution, not just in physics, but also in biology and in evolutionary theory, and all the hard sciences are going to have to expand its view and go, okay, there's more here than meets the eye, and perhaps we're never going to be able to really measure it in the same way that we can't measure directly some of the quantum effects that we see. We have to measure things that indicate that it's occurring.
Jimmy, have you got any particular comeback on what Nick has just said?
So my thought is more sort of, science is great in a specific realm.
Okay.
But I'm not to the point like Stephen Jay Gould, where they're sort of completely separate from religious faith and they're sort of non-overlapping magisteria. I think there's definitely areas, but I'm not also the opposite extreme, that they're in this sort of same place and they're completely antagonistic. There's some things that in terms of faith and philosophy and others are better at addressing, right? There's areas where scientific method is better at addressing. But there's definitely areas where they conflict and they sort of talk about truth in different ways. And so that's at the intersection are areas where I really think that sort of constructive conversation is going to be important. But there are, I think, definitely areas where, religious faith aren't able sort of to prove, you say scientific facts, and then there's definitely areas outside of the intersection that exist.
And do those areas not come into conflict for you? I mean, you come from a Christian tradition. It has certain teachings about the way the world is, right?
Yeah.
Does that not ever contradict to the things that you believe as a scientist?
I think there's ways of course, there's sort of questions on specific things, on the most famous things people talk about, evolution or age of the earth, and there's many different sort of Christian sort of perspectives on that, and also sort of I've had theological training before, and interestingly on these specific matters, one of the statements from the Presbyterian Church is that there's certain things that, in terms of the early creation story, that actually there's, on this side of heaven, we probably won't be able to know for certain. So it's sort of wrong for dogmatic for Christians to be sort of certain, like, okay, this is the age of the earth or not. So for those things, I think there's definitely ways that sort of there's reconciliation, and then ultimately, if sort of believe that the world is a coherent place and truth is coherent all over throughout the world, then there has to be sort of a harmony between these systems.
Why do you think it's so hard, especially in this country, for there to be, how shall I put it? Well, why is there such a tendency in this country for a lot of people to distrust science as an approach, as a methodology? And at the same time, the flip side of that is that it feels as if in this country, it's easier for people to be scientists and spiritual than it is in the UK. We were discussing this the other day, that in the UK, there's a very strong anti-spiritualism in the scientific tradition.
Yeah, so I grew up in Taiwan and sort of lived in the US for some time now, and this actually is a sort of intriguing phenomenon. Now me sort of living in the US and now as a US citizen, to sort of see such a sort of antagonism from parts of the Christian church against science. And I think there's a lack of understanding, really, to that, and it's sort of this, and that's why I think dialogue is very, very important for that. And I don't think a lot of that is sort of rooted in the doctrines of the faith, that science is wrong, right? So I think these are sort of more modern sort of cultural interpretations that I think will sort of shift and change, but that sort of doesn't sort of alter the sort of the thousands of history of harmony between science and faith.
Right. And Nick, you were talking to us when we chatted the other day about Britain and about how the atmosphere in Britain is different from what it is in the States. So just, the idea to me that the relationship between science and spirituality can be so culturally conditioned that it varies from country to country is kind of interesting. I mean, that also speaks to the fact that this is a culture clash.
Yes, I think, first of all, I really want to reiterate that in my world, there is a quite big distinction between religion and spirituality. A lot of religious people are spiritual and very spiritual. A lot of spiritual people are not religious. They are overlapping Venn diagram sets. Likewise, there are lots of New Age people who are very spiritual, and lots of New Age people who are totally egomaniacs, but dressed up in a kind of spiritual language. So just to really make sure we're clear. And what I think happens...
So maybe actually just for absolute clarity, define what you mean by spiritual.
So for me, spiritual is based upon inner experiencing of contemplation, meditation, reflection of your consciousness, your internal worldview, which leads one to what's called the perennial philosophy, which is a generalized understanding that in some way we are connected, all connected. And you can look at that in a globalization way, you can look at it in a quantum mechanics way, or you can just look at it just as a brotherhood, the brotherhood and sisterhood of human condition, or you can look at it, as I do, as all of those, and in some, I guess, ultimately material way that we're all one thing. And then the next step is from that realization that we're bigger than just this individual ego, we're part of everything, comes the experience of love, if you surrender to that thought, which is scary, because the ego doesn't want to think it's not the only thing in town, the only rodeo, you realize that you can surrender into it and go, oh my God, I am love, you are love, we're love. And isn't that beautiful? Which is then where I then come back in again, great, now let's go and put that into practice in the real world, in the material world, in the physical world of stuff, of people in poverty and, whatever. So that's what I hope that's really clear. And I think what the problem is, what happens in Britain, certainly, and other countries, is that the cultural narratives of science, and really scientism, the belief that all there is science, and the cultural narrative of spirituality and religion. I don't think a lot of the atheists understand that there is a thing called spirituality, which is not religion. And that's one of the great, almost boredoms of me reading these new atheist tracts. And I was a committed atheist, by the way. I went to Cambridge, where it's like the temple of atheism, and I prayed there. And I had to really do a lot of work to not stay an atheist, actually. And is that it's just always sort of misinterpreting the thing itself. And the classic thing that both religion and science do is they, I think, mistake what would be called the metaphor, we might call the meaning of something, and the thing itself. What Joseph Campbell would talk about, the connotation and the denotation. So when you're reading a mystical text or a religious text or some kind of teaching, there is a story going on, a metaphorical story, a narrative to help us understand and learn, and then there is an insight and a truth within it, and the two things are not necessarily having to be taken at the same time. So you can interpret these things to create spiritual meaning while still enjoying the religious narrative that you're being given, without having to say, well, evolution doesn't exist then, which I'm sure you've had that conversation with yourself. And then likewise, the scientists they start mistaking, the hard atheist, mechanistic, materialist scientists start mistaking the things that have been really successful. And science has been successful, so successful in one area, in showing how, with mathematics, how individual physical material things interact with each other and the causal chain of things. Really good at that. Best thing we've ever had. But that doesn't mean there isn't lots of other stuff going on, including consciousness, and you can have no theory of everything, which is the scientist's holy grail. I want a theory of everything. I'm going to be the one who gets the theory of everything, right? Relativity, quantum theory coming together. I'm going to explain it all, evolution, psychology, the whole thing. You can't have a theory of everything without bringing in both consciousness, because I think most of us will acknowledge it's real, we experience, it's here in the world, and without bringing in all these anomalistic things, including the reality that many people have had mystical, revelatory, awakening experiences, which you can scientifically study. Millions of people have had that experience. So unless you can account for it within your theory of everything, you don't have a theory of everything. You have a theory of the stuff we can see. And so the rabid atheism in Britain is an ideological battle. I think, as I always bring things usually down to some kind of level of fear, that and it's usually men, by the way. There's a very masculine, sort of dominating, controlling meme in the scientific tradition, certainly in the British model of controlling the world, predicting how to change things, making change, which can be very beautiful. Positivist idea of let's create society around what we learn. But the dark side of it, the shadow of it, is this desire to cloud out everything, control the narrative, and be scared of revelation, be scared of enlightenment, be scared of losing my ego because I've just spent 30 years being really right in science with my ego. And I really love that feeling of being right. And I go on to lecture and I'm right all the time, and I get to show some data to prove that I'm right, and I just enjoy that feeling.
You brought up the issue of consciousness, and consciousness is a rabbit hole, so I'm not sure I want to go too far down it. But it is sort of interesting. So even among non-spiritual, non-religious, materialist philosophers of science and scientists, there is a debate about whether consciousness is something that actually needs to be explained as a thing. This is the shorthand for this is it's the hard problem of consciousness. Is there such a thing as this consciousness phenomenon that is more than simply the firing of neurons and that we have to explain? Or is consciousness just a sort of emergent property? It appears as a natural result of having lots of brain cells connected. So without us getting into that debate itself, I actually want to ask Jimmy, I mean, for you, is that something that you think is within the realm of science to explain, or is consciousness for you something beyond it? And this, especially as someone who is working with the very basic building blocks of biology, with genes and cells.
Yeah, so my work is in genomics, and worked with sort of the early genome sequencing, human genome, and we worked on early cancer genome. And one of the big surprises with the human genome sequence is that genetically we are very, very similar to our mammalian counterparts, whether it's mice or chimpanzee, and that sort of was very surprising to some in terms of how similar that is. And then sort of made sort of the question, what does it mean to be human, right? Is it purely our genes? If it's purely our genes, how much are we different, and what's that aspect? So from the scientific perspective, as a genomic scientist, I don't know about whether we're able to study consciousness or not in sort of neuroscience, whether that's sort of emergent property or not. And as a person of faith, that I think that there are things that are besides just our body. So that I believe that we have a spirit, we have a soul. And I think that's a fact. So I don't know as a scientist whether this is something that can be studied or not.
Right. And when you say, as a person of faith, you believe there's a spirit or a soul, is that a different kind of knowledge or belief for you from scientific knowledge or belief? Do they exist on sort of different epistemological planes, if we can use that kind of wording?
Yeah. I think one of the things that's often sort of thrown out is that faith is something that's sort of blind, without evidence, and that's sort of very far from the truth. Right? For the Christian tradition, sort of Christ himself had to show all these things to prove that he had the authority and the resurrection, and it's sort of not a blind sort of proving of that. So in terms of sort of areas of knowledge, in terms of whether I know sort of whether there's a soul or not versus sort of scientific of proving, that both comes from sort of understanding. Those come from different sort of realms of understanding, but I don't think one is sort of like without evidence and one is sort of blind faith.
I see. Okay. This sort of raises another question for me, hearing you both talk about whether when we talk about spirituality, how much of this is just a question of labeling and terminology? So I used to have this debate with a friend when I lived in Israel who is a religious Jew, and he said to me, Gideon, you're a very spiritual person. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm not spiritual at all. I studied physics and Western philosophy. I don't consider myself spiritual. And he said, yes, you are. You sort of see the interconnectedness of things. And I said, I see the interconnectedness of things in the sense that I know that the atoms that make up my body are atoms that were forged in the nuclear furnace of a star many billions of years ago, and they're identical to, governed by the same forces that govern whatever creature might be living in another galaxy billions of years. I mean, so in that, if you want to call that spirituality, then fine, I'm spiritual. But I don't know, does that sound to you like spirituality?
This is a really important point, and actually something I'm very, very passionate about. I see so many people I know who have been brought up in the rationalist, Anglo-Saxon way of thinking about the world, and are atheists, who are definitely deeply spiritual. I call them love curious. They are kind of open to love talk, but do not want it New Age, do not want crystals and patchouli and Indian clothes. And the tragedy is that that's currently the package, although I'm working hard to change that, that's currently the package of spirituality. And take the package away, and there's this amazing truth which can, as I do, the wonder, the fact that everything that I'm part of was at one point in different stars, clouds of gas, people, whatever. Profound insight. And yet this tiny shift from going, I'm an atheist, but I obviously get this interconnection, and I've been on a dance floor and wanted to hug people and really felt the love of that, particularly in England, big scene there of dancing and community experience. I've picked up my baby and I've cried with the profound joy of being interconnected at this. We're in relationship, my oxytocin levels are changing, all this stuff is happening in this moment. But because of their attachment to the rational atheist paradigm as the truth, right, being right, and it's so difficult to let it go and still be not criticized by people, particularly where I come from, and I think also in New York, San Francisco, some of the sort of intellectual capitals of the world, Paris, is that they suffer. Needless suffering, because there's just one little bit more to realize. And in the history of Western philosophy, certainly in the last 100 years, in the continental philosophy, a lot of the great philosophers, maybe Wittgenstein and Heidegger, were getting so close to an Eastern or mystical worldview of this interconnection, but they just couldn't quite get there, and it never quite happened. So I said the same thing to you, I feel you're a deeply spiritual human being. That's why you're in this conversation, why we're having this stuff. And it's but a skip and a jump to fully experiencing that interconnection. And because when you get that interconnection, you get the love which allows you to then heal all the experience of disconnection and disappointment and pain that we've experienced when we grew up. And until we do that, we can't fully, I don't believe, live a heart-led life, live a heart-led career, heart-led business, etc. And when you call that religion, whether you do it within a Christian worldview, a Muslim, Sufi Muslim worldview, or a Jewish Kabbalistic, Hasidic worldview, it doesn't really matter to me, as long as you don't tell me that your worldview is the only worldview. So that's the tragedy, if you like, of the language of spirituality. But it's changing, and there's a massive hunger. Someone else was talking the other day at the millennial conversation, faith in millennials. And one of my projects is a media company, to bring in lots of millennials into a secular spirituality, take the New Age packaging off. We call it wisdom without the woo-woo. And that's our strapline. What I see is this unbelievable hunger in my generation, sort of baby Gen X, Gen Y, for meaning, for connection, for this thing, someone to say it's okay to say that you love, that you want to come into business and make decisions from the heart, that you want to have a purpose that's really meaningful. They want it, but the packaging isn't quite there yet, the metaphysics isn't quite there yet. And so I'm trying to sort of, I guess, evangelical.
Small e evangelical.
Small e, we talked about yesterday, a small e evangelical, to say, listen, it gets a lot better once you allow that feeling of interconnection to be there inside you.
So before we open up to questions, I want to ask one more thing, kind of make this a bit more practical. What would happen if we could heal or lessen this rift between the scientific and the spiritualist worldviews? Like, would it change how science is done? I mean, do you think that that scientists who have a more spiritual worldview would do science differently? Does it affect the way that you do science?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there are, even within the US, active efforts. So the AAAS, which is the organization that publishes one of the preeminent journals, Science, has specific program on dialogue between science and religion that's sort of bridging this. And I think there are definitely sort of detrimental effects for this, for people of faith not really understand science and sort of pose it, without really understanding it, and people of science opposing religion without truly understanding it. And I think you see this often, in the papers and in the discussion. So I think proper sort of dialogue would be very, very helpful. And I think just as in any other sort of groups and communities of people, whether it's different races, different countries, for people to sort of talk is going to be very helpful. In terms of as a scientist and what sort of daily life would look like differently, I think there's aspects where, in terms of the practical, if I pipette, do I pipette any differently? Do I code any differently? The actual sort of mechanics of it, of course, will look very, very similar. But in terms of how it's approached, the purpose, and I see sort of, as a Christian, I sort of see my purpose is really sort of the two things of loving God and loving others. And I do science as an expression of my sort of wanting to love God and others. So the way that the science that I do in terms of specific within cancer is hopefully one way that I can help reduce suffering in this world and be able to love others in that way. So, and that's sort of the way I approach it. And I think, whether there's how to approach science and how to sort of live as a scientist, as a person. Okay. And I think, whether it's, one big thing that's happening in science is actually, there's a lot of unethical things happening even in science. A lot of retractions, a lot of falsification of data, even in that. And as a Christian of something sort of integrity, that was something that really should not even sort of come into the discussion. So I think even in the everyday of how you do science and how you persevere and your purpose for it will look very, very different.
Right, okay.
Yes, so absolutely interesting and important. This is why I think it's the most important conversation of our age. Back to those three fails and how bringing them together can heal the fail, the three triple fails. The first fail is the theoretical one that I believe science, and it's really tricky because there's definitely a great reason to take religion and science and say you're two separate things. Don't bring your religion into science, particularly if you're a dogmatic believer that there's a truth, your religious truth. And so the separation of church and state, the separation of the scientific church and the religious church has been very important for the development of human knowledge. And that has also led to things like Nazi science, scientists doing science, but it's Nazi science, it's testing things on people and whatever, totally unethical, totally not heart-led. Soviet science, all these sorts of tragedies of science, one could even argue the Manhattan Project, as many people who worked on it did. So I believe that science, when it's informed, as you've talked about, from a heart place, a place of love, is incredibly powerful and beautiful and amazing. And it's also policy, which is often scientifically based, evidence-based, is informed by love, not dogma, love. And it doesn't matter how you get to that point, but it is a refining. It takes time to develop a sense of what's love and what's ego. And they often are quite difficult to work out, and you have to do a lot of work to do that. We call it leadership work. That's the metaphor, that's the polite metaphor and organizational work for this conversation around love and values and integrity and stuff. Likewise, as I said, spirituality, I think, needs science to say, let's not go off into the woo lands, because there's some things we can't really, I just don't know if they're spirit guides. You might think that your intuition is a spirit guide. That's what my wife and I talk about this a lot. She's a Californian. And she goes, no, I talk to my spirit guides. And I go, totally get that you're getting intuition, and I love that you're getting intuition. That's great. If you want to call it spirit guides, and maybe they are actually physical entities, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I know that you're refining yourself to listen to your intuition, and that's beautiful, and let's act on that. So that's, I think, the one level. The next level, as someone who was plagued by fibromyalgia, chronic pain syndrome, depression, anxiety, as an atheist, using all the tools that we have in the materialist atheist paradigm for healing, psychotherapy for years, which Freud took out spirituality purposefully because he wanted it to be a science, Prozac, blah, 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 and only fully being able to heal myself and be a full contribution to society when I brought spirituality into my psychological understanding of how to heal. I don't believe we'll get the difference we want in depression and suicide and stress. Someone called it the great black plague of 21st century. We're not going to get that change until we bring spirituality into understanding of the science of well-being, of thriving, as I call it, not just happiness, thriving. And then finally, until we can help our organizations, non-profit, which are usually very atheistic, government, which usually has lots of spirituality in it, but you can't talk about it because it's not the right thing. And I heard a politician yesterday talking about that quandary. And of course, business, who when we bring spirituality back into science in some way, and that then will filter into technology, because technology is an outshoot of science, the algorithmic paradigm where it doesn't really matter what happens as long as the algorithm's good, efficiency, machines, more productivity out of people. Until we bring spirituality back into that stuff, we're not going to get the climate changes that we want to see, the poverty changes, the child abuse changes, the child soldier changes. We're not going to get any of it. And the three people who knew this best, and the ones that everyone always brings up when talking about mass transformational change, and I love doing this in England because they always, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Mandela, all three of them were dedicated practitioners of a deep, deep, deep spirituality of love, bringing that love into their work in policy. And that's why they changed things, because they were inclusive, they weren't angry, they weren't fighting, but they were strong. And if we want to have those changes, we're going to have to bring love back into the conversation in a way that doesn't end us up living in Marin County and being a hippie, because that's not what the world, I don't think, needs right now.
Right, so you're both, thank you. So you're both talking about spirituality as informing the way that we do science and what we choose to do it about, and the decisions that we take for which we use scientific tools. And the discussion about the epistemology, about what we know about the world from science that we can't, or that what we know about the world from spirituality that we could not know from science, is really a separate issue. It's something that you might agree on or disagree on, but a lot of your focus has really been about spirituality as it affects our behavior. Mm-hmm. Right. So with that, we've got a few minutes left. Any questions? I can see, and the microphone is there, so let's start at the back there. Yep.
Great presentation. I am a PhD clinical psychologist, so I've obviously grappled with this for a while. Clearly, there's no answer because it's the last 5%. Humans cognitively can only think three-dimensionally. So if we could think that fourth dimension, we would know what started before we started. Without that, we have to create whatever that was, whether it's God, whether it's this, whether it's spirit. I would suggest this. I'm probably a better scientist because I've incorporated humanality into my life. I was raised a Reformed Jew. I practice Reformed Judaism, but I'm an atheist, which basically means I don't believe in God. I would suggest that everything you say is 100% true if you remove this thing. So instead of calling it spirituality, because spirits and mystic and whatever gets a little strange to scientists, if you would call it humanality, the dialogue and the narrative would be much more comfortable and it would be much more better received. Just a suggestion.
I don't use the S word very often. I'm sorry, what? The S word. Spirituality. So I've written a book about science and spirituality and how it affects everyone, and I think I used the S word twice.
I think we're agreeing on the same.
Absolutely. I don't use the S word. I use wisdom. I use heart-led, whatever. I use a lot of things that very rarely use the S word because it makes people get all funny.
But I think you're implying God with that.
I'm not implying a personal God, a face, a thing.
Whatever, impersonal, big.
I'm not even implying a God. I'm implying that the nature of experience, the nature of existence, is interconnected. Boom. And Spinoza called it God or nature. Pick. But for me, it's definitely not a God. Definitely not. I would call myself an atheist, a spiritual atheist. If people, okay. One guy doesn't like that idea, but yeah.
I think there's two things going on here. Is whether what are questions that science is able to answer or not, right? And there's obviously things that we sort of seem to agree here that there's a lot of things that science is not set up to answer. And that's question number one. And then the question number two is, are the God questions going to be part of that? Or is there a God or is there not a God? And these are sort of two separate issues for you pointing out. And so for you, it seems like you sort of agree on this sort of the first thing. And the second thing, obviously, we haven't dived into does God exist? That's a whole other discussion, obviously. But sort of really sort of understanding is science in itself able to explain all that there is? And I think we are agreeing here from different perspectives that there's more than just a purely sort of a positivist science explanation of all that there is.
There was a gentleman at the back there who had his hand up. Thank you.
I am a Reformed Jew. I believe in God. I feel my view is that science and spirituality and religion are in different domains, that they look at whatever exists from different viewpoints with different beginning hypotheses. I feel in your presentation, and I'm wondering why, I feel like I should be converted to your point of view. And I just need to express that, and I'm wondering why, with your sensitivity and your spirituality, I feel that a real pressure to be converted to your point of view rather than maintain my view, which is spirituality, belief in God, and science are in different domains.
Either of you want to say
Yeah,
anything on
so
that?
I addressed it a little bit. So, I mean, there's the two extremes. There's on one end, they're in completely different domains. You know, Stephen Jay Gould had the word noma, sort of magisteria that you know, don't intersect at all. This is one sort of perspective. And in the other opposite perspective, they're overlapping, completely overlap. They're fighting over the same things. So my perspective is that there's somewhere in the middle. It's sort of a Venn diagram where there's areas definitely where that they sort of speak in each other, that they're designed to be able to speak to, but then there's different areas of intersection, and that's why there's even sort of discussions like that, because they definitely do intersect. If they don't intersect at all, we probably wouldn't have even had this sort of type of discussion. So I think people sort of tend to sort of lean one way or the other, and I'm sort of helping people think that it's not just purely a fight. They're exactly fighting for the same truths, but also they're not completely sort of orthogonal. That's sort of my perspective.
I would add just on that what we've kind of talked about, which we haven't really defined, is that there's a practical wisdom and there's a philosophical wisdom. And I love conjecture about the philosophical. Love it. Is there one thing? My experience is one thing, not two things, but whatever. And it doesn't actually matter that much. As Buddha said, there's some things we just can't know. What matters to me most is the practice, and whether you come from it from a religious point of view and believe there's two different magisteria, or whether you come from it from a spiritual point of view and think it's all one thing, as long as you are, I hope, experiencing a relief of your suffering from that love, and then are acting in the world with that love to connect with the people you love and the world that we all love. So we've kind of conflated the two conversations on stage here. So you can be a very spiritual, heart-led human being without ever really talking about the philosophical questions of, does God exist? Is there something beyond, outside the system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Down here. And it's to say, even though both of these men do describe themselves as evangelists, there is no pressure to convert. You are free to.
And there's no collection tin.
Yeah, we're not going to do an altar call at the end.
But you might have to sign your house away.
Indeed.
Thank you. My name is Edith Harrell, and thank you for sharing your ideas and your epistemologies. So I am a spiritual scientist, and I was educated to be a scientist at MIT, which is considered not very spiritual. I had one mentor and colleague called Seymour Papert, and he was a mathematician who always reminded me that whenever you want to tackle any problem and to really look at the epistemology of mathematics, you have to have a physicist in the room. This is because physicists and mathematicians really think very differently, he told me, about same problems. And everything he did was with his heart and passion. And he said the heart and the passion of a physicist and all their imagery and all their frame of mind is so different than the mathematicians. Don't forget to always have a physicist in the room. Next door, I had Marvin Minsky. And Marvin Minsky said to really think about artificial intelligence and the hardest problems of machine learning, which is understanding emotion, humor, and consciousness. You have to have a musician in the room. And you don't just have to have any musician, but people who are composers, or who knows how to improvise on Beethoven and Bach. And that helps him think about the epistemology of artificial intelligence, mathematics, and all the problems that he was, with his heart, solving. So what is the guiding principle, I think, that I was guided by, that I think I hear you're saying? One is epistemological pluralism. You always have to be yourself, not really bringing them together, Nick, and I would like to argue with that, but being able to be here and to be there and to be able to look at the problems from both epistemologies. And the other one is this notion of interdisciplinary that they totally refuted, and they said be anti-disciplinary. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, if I'm totally honest. Is it that you think I'm saying you have to...
You're trying to converge epistemologies when I'm saying let it be pluralistic just train yourself to think about similar questions from...
I think I'm saying, however your epistemology is your decision and your choice and your worldview, but please come into society and community with your heart open. And however your... epistemology is a great thing that I love. I can spend evenings talking about it. I love to chat 5 hours about it. It doesn't actually take up that much of my day job. My day job is working out how to help people heal themselves, tikkun hanefesh, and heal the world, tikkun olam. That's my interest. We're here talking a little bit conjecturally about some of the epistemological questions.
But Jimmy really clearly separates it. Said certain questions I can answer from this epistemology and certain questions I only from this. And he keeps it this way. One empowers the other.
Do you think you do that?
He's not trying to converge them, and I think you are.
So let me answer there. So I think I agree with you on sort of the illustration is beautiful. I love it, sort of having the different disciplines come together. And I think, as we talk about science, science can't answer more than just epistemology, like questions of metaphysics or aesthetics. What's beautiful? What's moral? Right? So have sort of a multitude of sort of conversations of sort of coming into it. And I think to be humble to different epistemologies, definitely, and to compare them. But ultimately, there's going to be often conflict between them, and to then sort of be civil about sort of just accepting and describing. And I think everybody's sort of looking for ultimately, as a scientist, sort of absolute truth, whatever that is, with a capital T, right? And as we journey with our all different sort of presuppositions in our systems, and hopefully sort of compare that and help each other to arrive to that place.
All of our questions came from this side of the room, and we have one on that side. So, and I think this is probably going to have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'm Bill Spence, and I'm a retired PhD research geophysicist. My dad was a fundamentalist Baptist preacher. And so my life is, other than my professional career, been defined by examining the intersection of science and religion. And I'm a spiritual non-believer. That's where I've landed. And I think it's very interesting how we've evolved. The universe, 13.5 billion years old. Our solar system and Earth, 4.5 billion years old. Life on Earth, 3.2. Modern man, 250,000 years, preceded by pre-hominids. 250,000 years. Modern religion, the last 2,000 years. So a lot of, I think, modern religion is just the invention of man, an attempt to explain our social relationship with the cosmos. So if you folks examined the evolution of life in terms of social structure that leads to us and defines what being human is all about?
So, I can start. No, I think sort of walking through that history, and then we can come to that. I think in the same way that sort of your illustration with Richard Dawkins and with Nick, sort of seeing that complexity and marveling, and how the interpretation is. Richard Dawkins would say, "Oh, wow, this amazing blind chance is able to do this and marvel at that," whereas sort of Nick is able to marvel from religious. In the same way, that those facts can be interpreted. Wow. Religion is sort of modern, or God's been around for a long time, and the creation of man has been later from that. So there's sort of one sort of theologian talks about, Cornelius Van Til talks about there's no such thing as a sort of brute fact. Every fact is ultimately sort of interpreted through sort of everybody's lenses. So in sort of your fact, that there's ways that a religious person, a spiritual person, a different people of faith, or atheists could be able to interpret it in different ways.
With that, we are going to have to wrap it up. But thank you all very much for coming, and thank you.